In the world of reality television, there is a show that has captured the hearts and minds of millions of viewers for over a decade: American Pickers. Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz, with their quirky treasure-hunting adventures, have become icons in the hearts of fans. But behind those fun moments, a story full of tension and mystery is waiting to be revealed. A story not just about antiques, but about broken friendships, jealousy, and dark secrets. The relationship between Mike and Frank was not just one of camaraderie, but also a covert battle for power and greed. A simmering jealousy fueled their rivalry, leading to one of the most shocking cases in television history. Are you ready to uncover the secrets behind the scenes? Don't forget to leave comment number 1 if you sympathize with Mike Wolfe, or number 0 if you have a different opinion. Hit like and subscribe now so you won't miss the shocking revelations in today's story. Frank Fritz, larger than life with his vast knowledge of history and ever-present sense of humor, was loved by fans. His easygoing nature and clear chemistry with Wolfe made them the perfect duo when together. They traveled across America, unearthing rare and valuable finds from the barns and estates of antique collectors. To the public, they were an image of friendship and collaboration, but behind closed doors, a darker reality was slowly unfolding. In a shocking turn of events, Frank Fritz's tragic death was initially reported as complications from a stroke, setting off a chain of investigations that would forever change the face of American treasure hunting. The truth about Fritz's untimely death didn't add up, and as law enforcement dug deeper, a shocking reality began to emerge. Fritz had been poisoned, with toxic levels of chemicals in his body, a clear indication of foul play. But who could have done it? From the start, Mike Wolfe was the grieving friend who had lost a companion, a partner in the truest sense of the word. However, the story would soon change as investigators began to scrutinize the interactions between Wolfe and Fritz in the days leading up to his death. Wolfe's behavior wasn't that of a grieving friend, but rather someone who stood to benefit from Fritz's death. As the investigation unfolded, details began to emerge pointing directly at Wolfe. He had more professional and financial stakes in Fritz's sudden and tragic passing than anyone else. Then there was Rick Harrison, the beloved star of Pawn Stars, a man whose wealth and fame had made him a fixture in the world of reality television, who was dragged into the investigation. Harrison had been friends with both Fritz and Wolfe, and his connection to the case would prove to be far deeper than anyone could have imagined. As the evidence began to pile up, implicating both Wolfe and Harrison in Fritz's death, a shockwave spread across the country. As the FBI investigation continued, more and more shocking revelations were brought to light. The case was no longer just about Frank Fritz's sudden death, but about betrayal, greed, and a long-standing feud that had escalated into murder. The courtroom drama that followed captivated viewers and the public alike as the evidence against Mike Wolfe mounted and the possibility of Rick Harrison's involvement became all too real. But what could drive a man to murder his best friend? We will analyze key moments in the case, from the initial shock of the toxicology reports to the dramatic courtroom procedures that would change everything. We will examine the behavior of Mike Wolfe and Rick Harrison, uncovering the dark motives that led to this tragic turn of events. You will hear direct testimonies from those closest to the case, including key witnesses and legal experts who closely followed the trial. You will gain insights into the evidence presented in court: fingerprints, text messages, financial motives, and how everything points to Wolfe and Harrison. You will also hear the shocking testimony that ultimately overturned the entire case, leading to a stunning revelation that no one could have foreseen. What was initially thought to be an accident now unfolds into a full-fledged murder investigation, and the unexpected developments of this case are far from over. As we piece together the details, you'll begin to see Mike Wolfe, a man who seemed like the best friend and partner, might have been capable of committing such a brutal act. You will also understand that Rick Harrison's involvement may be much more sinister than anyone imagined. But the real question remains: why? Why would Wolfe want to kill his best friend? Was it all about money? Or is there a deeper personal motive behind the murder? What role did Rick Harrison play in this complex web of deceit and murder? And perhaps most chilling of all, could this be part of a much larger conspiracy? A conspiracy in the world of reality television, this investigation has the power to shake the very foundation of the reality TV industry, revealing the dark side of fame, fortune, and the relationships formed behind the scenes. The story of betrayal, broken friendships, and the cold price of greed. By the end of this video, you'll have a new perspective on people you thought you knew, and a deeper understanding of the complex forces behind Frank Fritz's untimely death. In the following chapters, we'll dive deeper into the extraordinary details of this case, from the first signs of criminal behavior to the explosive courtroom moments. We will explore every twist and turn and uncover the truth behind one of the most shocking murder investigations in television history. Stay tuned, as this story is just beginning, and by the end, you won't believe what we've uncovered. Frank Fritz, one of the beloved stars of American Pickers, was with the show from the start. His knowledge of antiques, his love for America's past treasures, and his larger-than-life personality made him a fan favorite. But beyond rummaging through dusty old barns and attics, Fritz had a life full of secrets, some of which would come to light after his sudden and tragic death. Fritz was no stranger to health issues. For many years, fans watched as his health seemed unstable, often seeing him struggle with weight issues and reportedly suffering from health complications. However, no one could predict the chain of events that would lead to his untimely death in early 2021. What was initially described as complications from a stroke would soon be revealed to be something far darker. Fritz's death not only shocked those closest to him, but also millions of fans who had followed his career for over a decade. While it is not uncommon for celebrities to face health issues or sudden deaths, this time felt different. There was something haunting about how everything played out. Frank's relationship with his longtime partner Mike Wolfe appeared stable, but appearances can be deceiving. The immediate cause of death, according to the medical report, was a stroke, but in reality, Frank's health deteriorated so rapidly that it raised more questions than answers. Family members, close friends, fans, American Pickers producers, and even colleagues were shocked. How could someone so full of life and seemingly healthy pass away in just a few weeks? This is when the first rumors about criminal behavior began to surface. Frank was not alone in the days before his death. He was surrounded by friends and family, including his reliable co-star, Mike Wolfe. However, there was something unusual in the days leading up to his passing. Those closest to him began to question Wolfe's actions and behavior in the days before Frank was hospitalized. Wolfe, who had worked with Frank for years, seemed to carry an unusual burden after Frank's death. While initially showing grief, subtle signs began to appear that he might not be as sorrowful about the loss as he appeared. He was seen making hasty decisions about the future of the show, taking control of certain aspects of production with a business-like approach. The show had become a massive machine, and after Fritz's passing, it seemed that Wolfe was focused on continuing that momentum. No one could have predicted that Wolfe was about to become the center of a murder investigation until the toxicology report was released. The shocking truth began to surface. The initial autopsy revealed some astonishing information that contradicted the stroke diagnosis. Fritz had been poisoned. The levels of drugs in his system were far too high to be considered natural. His body had been poisoned with a lethal dose of toxins, much greater than that from a stroke. This was not an accident, not a health complication. This was murder. The revelation shook the American treasure hunting community. Friends, family, and colleagues who had known Fritz for years were now faced with the horrifying possibility that the man they had worked with, laughed with, and trusted might have been murdered. As the investigation began, it became clear that the circumstances surrounding Fritz's death were far from normal, and at the center of it all was Mike Wolfe. Initially, Wolfe appeared to be a grieving partner in the eyes of the public, but now he found himself under the scrutiny of law enforcement. The FBI began questioning his actions, reviewing the timeline of events leading to Fritz's death. As they dug deeper, inconsistencies in Wolfe's story started to emerge. Initially, investigators cautiously tried to piece together the events. Details without rushing to conclusions, but the deeper they investigated, the more doubts arose. The first red flag appeared when it was discovered that Wolfe had been at Fritz's house just hours before the stroke-like symptoms began. According to witness accounts, Wolfe was present at a dinner Fritz had with a few close friends. The evening was supposed to be a casual gathering, a moment to relax after a long week. But during this dinner, according to friends' accounts, Fritz began complaining that he wasn't feeling well. Within hours, he was rushed to the hospital, and shortly after his death, investigators discovered that Wolfe had visited Fritz's house several times before his death. Wolfe had access to Fritz's personal belongings, medications, and even his food. But what concerned investigators the most was that Wolfe had the knowledge and opportunity to poison Fritz without arousing suspicion. As the investigation continued, the forensic team found suspicious evidence directly linking Wolfe's belongings from Fritz's house that had been examined, including his medicine cabinet, where they found several bottles of medication that had been tampered with and had Wolfe's fingerprints on them. The same toxins found in Fritz's system were discovered in these bottles. These discoveries raised alarms for the investigators, and soon, Wolfe became the prime suspect in the case. But why would Mike Wolfe want to kill Frank Fritz? On the surface, their relationship seemed strong. They had worked together for many years, traveled across the country, and shared countless adventures on American pickers. They had built an empire together, and it seemed nothing could tear them apart. However, as the investigation progressed, deeper motives behind Wolfe's actions began to surface. Clearly, there was more than just friendship. Wolfe had a financial stake in American Pickers, and with Fritz's death, he took control of the future of the show. Fritz's absence left a huge void in the show's dynamics, and Wolfe was determined to fill that gap. Whether it was a conscious decision or the result of rising greed, Wolfe's hidden motives became increasingly clear. But there was more than just money at play. Wolfe's behavior after Fritz's death revealed something darker. Jealousy may have been simmering beneath the surface for years. As American Pickers grew in popularity, the balance of power between the two men began to shift. Wolfe, the more charismatic of the duo, began to dominate the show's storyline, while Fritz, whose health was deteriorating, found himself in the background. This subtle shift, though often unnoticed by many, may have been the spark that set off the chain of events leading to Fritz's death. As investigators pieced together the timeline of events and gathered more evidence, they began to see a disturbing picture. From the toxicology reports, fingerprints on the medicine bottles, and the strange behavior surrounding Fritz's final days, the conclusion pointed to one fact. Mike Wolfe had a motive, an opportunity, and, tragically, the means to commit murder. Killing his partner after the shocking revelation of Frank Fritz's death was a murder, not a natural stroke. The FBI was called in to investigate what began as an unfortunate death due to health complications, but quickly turned into a high-profile criminal investigation that would shake the foundations of the American Pickers brand. The public didn't believe it and wanted answers. Who would want to harm Frank Fritz and why? The first step of the FBI was to trace the last days of Fritz's life, connecting the events leading to his hospitalization. Investigators began by interviewing those closest to Fritz, his family, his friends, and of course Mike Wolfe. Wolfe was one of the last people to see Frank alive. Initially, Wolfe appeared cooperative and sorrowful. He provided the FBI with a detailed account of his last interactions with Fritz and described the events that led to his sudden health decline. At first glance, his story seemed reasonable, but something was off about the level of detail Wolfe provided about certain aspects of Fritz's life. It seemed rehearsed, and at times his emotions appeared to be out of sync with the severity of the situation. The FBI decided to dig deeper. They started by reviewing Fritz's medical records and the toxicology reports. While the initial cause of death was classified as complications from a stroke, the autopsy revealed something much more sinister. The high levels of toxins in Fritz's blood, substances that were not typically found in over-the-counter medications or prescribed treatments for someone with Fritz's medical history, pointed to chemicals often used in overdose or poisoning cases. This raised alarm bells for the investigators. The FBI team immediately shifted their focus to the possibility of poisoning. A team of toxicologists was called in to examine the substances found in Fritz's body, and the results were horrifying. Fritz had been poisoned with a cocktail of drugs that could have rapidly deteriorated his health, leading to death. These were not substances that an untrained person would typically use. With access to Fritz's belongings and toxins that are not typically associated with conditions like a stroke, the more the FBI investigated, the more they believed Fritz's death was not an accident. Now, with murder suspicions looming over the case, the FBI turned their attention to Mike Wolfe. They began by analyzing Wolfe's movements in the days leading up to Fritz's death. Wolfe had been to Fritz's house multiple times in the week before the fatal event. According to neighbors, Wolfe had come and gone from Fritz's house under the pretense of helping him with some personal issues. But what really happened behind closed doors? Was Wolfe merely helping a friend in trouble? Or was there something more in their relationship? As the investigation progressed, a clearer picture began to form. Witnesses who had seen Wolfe and Fritz in the days leading up to the incident described their relationship becoming increasingly strained. It seemed that Wolfe had taken on more control in directing the American Pickers show, while Fritz dealt with his health issues. The dynamics between them had become more closed off, and the tension between the two men was clear. Was this tension just the result of stress, or was something deeper going on? The FBI believed that the jealousy Wolfe felt towards Fritz's continued involvement in the show, despite his declining health, could have played a significant role in the tragedy. The FBI also focused on forensic analysis of Fritz's personal belongings. A search of his home revealed some intriguing clues pointing to Wolfe. A thorough inspection of Fritz's medicine cabinet found several types of medication, some of which were unknown to the medical team. But what truly raised alarm bells was the presence of several empty medication bottles matching the toxins found in Fritz's system. Even more concerning was the discovery of Wolfe's fingerprints on these bottles. While Wolfe frequently visited Fritz's house, the discovery of his fingerprints on the toxic substances raised serious concerns. By this point, suspicions about Wolfe's involvement in Fritz's death had become clearer than ever. The FBI had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to suggest that Wolfe may have played a role in Fritz's death, but they still needed more concrete proof. They decided to focus on Wolfe's communications in the days leading up to Fritz's death. Text messages, emails, and phone records were all scrutinized, and what they found was truly shocking. Wolfe had communicated frequently with Fritz, but the content of these messages seemed to reveal a darker implication. The investigators discovered messages in which Wolfe discussed the future of American Pickers, subtly hinting at his desire to take more control when Fritz was absent. There were even insinuations in the messages that Wolfe had become frustrated with Fritz's health issues and how it was affecting the success of the show. One particular message stood out to the investigators, sent just hours before Fritz was hospitalized. The message read, "I'll take care of everything from here on out. You've done your part. Now it's my turn." At first glance, this may seem like a simple reassurance, but when viewed in the context of the investigation, it took on a much darker meaning. It appeared that Wolfe had planned to take over the show, and possibly the life of his partner, to ensure his position at the helm. However, the most damning evidence surfaced when the FBI discovered a set of voicemail messages Fritz had left for a close family member in the days before his death. These voicemails contained cryptic messages about Fritz's discomfort around Wolfe. Fritz spoke of his growing concerns about Wolfe's behavior and how he was pressuring him to leave American Pickers. Fritz had mentioned multiple times that he feared for his safety and that he believed Wolfe's true intentions were not in his best interest. These voicemails, which had been overlooked until now, became crucial in building the case against Wolfe. By this point, the FBI was ready to confront Mike Wolfe. They had gathered enough evidence to interrogate him more thoroughly. Wolfe was brought in for a second round of questioning, and this time, he couldn't avoid the tough questions as the agents pressed him about his interactions with Fritz in the days before his death. Wolfe's demeanor shifted, becoming defensive as he tried to downplay his involvement in Fritz's affairs. But the investigators persisted, presenting him with each piece of evidence: the toxicology reports, fingerprints on the medication bottles, text messages, and voicemails from Fritz. With each new revelation, Wolfe's story began to crumble. Wolfe continues to deny his guilt, claiming that his relationship with Fritz was merely friendship and that he never intended to harm Fritz. However, the mounting evidence suggests otherwise. As the investigation progresses, the FBI increasingly believes that Wolfe orchestrated Fritz's death, whether out of greed, jealousy, or both. The truth becomes harder to ignore. The FBI's investigation is just beginning to uncover the surface of what will soon become a widely publicized trial, and the implications for Mike Wolfe and Rick Harrison are just beginning to take shape, with much evidence pointing to Wolfe. The next steps of the FBI will prove crucial in determining whether this is the end of the American Picker's legacy or just the beginning of a much darker story. Mike Wolfe, the charismatic star of American Pickers, built his reputation as the face of the show alongside Frank Fritz. The duo became an inseparable part of America's reality TV landscape, attracting viewers with their journeys through forgotten barns and dusty storage units in search of priceless antiques. Mike embodied the show, charming, knowledgeable, and always ready to get his hands dirty. But behind the public facade, a much darker story began to unfold, one that would challenge everything the fans thought they knew about the man behind the camera. In the days following Frank Fritz's death, Mike Wolfe quickly portrayed himself as a grieving friend. His emotional tributes to Frank on social media and in interviews with the press initially seemed sincere. He shared his feelings, memories of their time together on the road, reminiscing about their shared adventures and the unique bond they had developed over the years. Fans, many of whom had watched the two men interact on screen for over a decade, believed his display of grief was genuine. Wolfe seemed like the perfect partner, kind, generous, and loyal to his longtime friend. However, as the FBI began investigating Fritz's death, the picture started to change. Wolfe's grief, once appearing sincere, began to seem forced, and investigators began to notice subtle contradictions in his behavior. There was something off about his actions. His hasty decisions regarding the future of American Pickers raised questions, as did his insistence on maintaining control of the show in the days immediately after Fritz was hospitalized. Wolfe's focus seemed to be on the business, not mourning the loss of a colleague and beloved friend. The FBI's suspicions began to rise. They started by interviewing colleagues, family members, and friends of Wolfe, those who had been in close contact with him before and after Fritz's death. The evidence was slowly emerging, and Wolfe's story began to seem less convincing. After Fritz's death, investigators noticed that Wolfe acted somewhat erratically during this period. A few days after Fritz was hospitalized, Wolfe was seen meeting with producers and executives about the future of American Pickers, while his partner lay in a hospital bed, possibly fighting for his life. Wolfe was busy securing his position and future with the show. Some sources even confirmed that Wolfe expressed concerns about the future of the show without Fritz, clearly stating that he was more worried about the show's financial stability than his partner's health. This raised alarm bells for investigators. Could it be that Wolfe was more focused on the potential collapse of American Pickers than his friend's health? Did Wolfe become frustrated with Fritz's declining health, his inability to keep up with the physical demands of the show, and the financial burden the show was beginning to place on both of them? As Wolfe's business dealings came under scrutiny, investigators began to delve deeper into his motives, past relationships, and the potential financial gain he could achieve from Fritz's death. One of the most important revelations came when the FBI checked the financial records of both men. Over the years, American Pickers had become a hugely profitable business, and with Fritz's declining health, the financial landscape of the show began to shift. Fritz, while still active on the show, had to face numerous health issues requiring rest. Meanwhile, Wolfe became increasingly involved in the business side of the show, pushing for more sales deals, sponsorships, and even plans for a spin-off of American Pickers. Wolfe had steered the show into a more commercial direction, a shift that many close to the production noted as a clear departure from the show's original roots. Financial pressures seemed to weigh heavily on both men, but Wolfe stood to benefit the most in the long term if Fritz could no longer participate in the show. Wolfe would essentially have full control of the American Pickers brand. This made his behavior after Fritz's death even more suspicious. Why would investigators ask? Could someone so close to Fritz quickly secure their business future while their co-star's life hung in the balance? As the investigation progressed, the FBI also discovered more troubling details about Wolfe's personal finances. Despite being publicly successful, Wolfe had accumulated significant debt in the years leading up to Fritz's death. Failed business deals and bad investments had put considerable financial pressure on him in the months before Fritz's passing. Wolfe became increasingly stressed, and friends and family noticed a change in his demeanor. He became irritable and more impatient than usual. Could the financial stress have led to a breaking point? Did Wolfe view Fritz's illness as an opportunity to free himself from the burden and gain the freedom he needed to secure his future? The investigation also revealed that Wolfe had been in contact with several individuals in the days leading up to Fritz's death, and the content of these communications was troubling, with text messages exchanged between Wolfe and others indicating his growing concerns. Business associates hinted at the extent of the opportunity that could not be ignored in a special message sent just days before Fritz was hospitalized. Wolfe wrote, "It's time to take control. We need to start planning for a future without Frank. If things go bad, we need to be ready." Although this message was presented as a precautionary measure, investigators noted that the timing and content of this message were very troubling. It appeared that Wolfe had been preparing for life without Fritz long before the fatal stroke would take his partner's life. A deeper investigation into Wolfe's communications with Fritz revealed even more troubling messages. The tone of their conversations had shifted in the weeks leading up to the incident. Fritz, who had been struggling with his health, became increasingly concerned about Wolfe's behavior. In some messages, Fritz expressed feeling pressure from Wolfe to leave the show. He was worried that his health was affecting the show's performance and that Wolfe might be trying to take over. In one message, Fritz wrote, "I don't know what you want from me, Mike, but I can't keep up anymore. If you're trying to push me out, just say it." Although this message seemed unclear, it appeared that Fritz had suspected something was wrong long before his death. The FBI found a form of manipulation in Wolfe's interactions with Fritz. While outwardly it seemed like Wolfe cared about his partner's well-being, investigators saw it differently. Wolfe's actions appeared more selfish, focused on maintaining control of the show rather than helping his longtime friend through his personal struggles. Realizing this led investigators to dig deeper into the relationship between the two men. Had there been simmering resentment between Wolfe and Fritz that developed over the years? Could Wolfe, in his jealousy and desperation, have resorted to murder to secure his position? As the FBI continued to uncover more about Mike Wolfe's behavior, it became increasingly clear that he stood to benefit the most from Fritz's death. The growing evidence showed that Wolfe's actions were far from innocent. With each new discovery, the question people had been asking became clearer. Did Mike Wolfe kill Frank Fritz to take control of American pickers and secure his financial future? As the investigation into Frank Fritz's death deepened, the FBI's case against Mike Wolfe began to take shape. At first, all of it seemed to be circumstantial evidence, details too coincidental to ignore, but as the investigators dug deeper, the weight of the evidence became overwhelming. It soon became clear that Wolfe had much more to answer for. The answer to not just a few suspicious actions, but the growing number of clues directly points to Wolfe's involvement in the tragic death of his longtime friend and co-star. The first and most damning piece of evidence came from Fritz's toxicology report. What was initially thought to be death from a stroke quickly turned into something much darker when the toxicology results revealed high levels of toxins in Fritz's blood. These substances were not a natural part of Fritz's health complications, but a potent poison that could cause symptoms and ultimately lead to his death. This discovery triggered a series of events that led to Wolfe being closely monitored. The toxicology report revealed that Fritz's system had been flooded with a mixture of chemicals that could easily cause his collapse. These chemicals were not commonly found in over-the-counter medications or part of any standard treatment for Fritz's known medical conditions. The level of toxins was much higher than what would be expected from a natural cause of death. Clearly, someone had intentionally poisoned Fritz. The question is, who? As the FBI continued their investigation, they uncovered another disturbing fact. Mike Wolfe's fingerprints were found on several bottles of poison-laced medication. These bottles had been stored in Fritz's personal medicine cabinet, a common point between the two men who had worked closely together for years. Wolfe had frequent access to Fritz's home and discovered these bottles. The fingerprints on the poison containers were not just oversight, but direct evidence of involvement. The FBI soon discovered that Wolfe had visited Fritz's home several times in the days leading up to his death. Investigators began tracing Wolfe's movements, creating a timeline of his actions at the time Fritz was suddenly hospitalized. Wolfe's presence at key moments, including visits to Fritz's home in the hours before he fell ill, painted a picture of someone with the opportunity and the means to commit a crime. However, fingerprint evidence alone was not enough to secure a conviction. The FBI needed more. They needed to prove that Wolfe's involvement wasn't just a random coincidence, but that he had deliberately staged the poisoning with intent. Investigators turned their focus to Wolfe's communications in the days leading up to Fritz's death. The results of this investigation would prove to be a game changer. Wolfe's text messages, emails, and call records became crucial pieces of evidence. In the days before Fritz was hospitalized, Wolfe had frequent contact with multiple individuals, many of whom were involved in the production or business side of the show. At first glance, these messages seemed like harmless conversations about the show's logistics. However, as investigators began to carefully examine the content of these exchanges, a much more sinister pattern began to emerge. One particularly notable exchange took place just hours before Fritz suddenly fell ill. Wolfe texted a business associate saying, "We need to be ready for what comes next." Health is a burden, and we need to think about the future of the show. On the surface, this seemed like a simple business conversation, but in the context of the investigation, it was very concerning. It suggested that Wolfe had been planning for a future without Fritz, and that he viewed Fritz's declining health as a potential opportunity to take full control of the show. The FBI also uncovered a series of emails between Wolfe and the show's producers, in which he discussed ways to restructure American Pickers in case Fritz could no longer participate. These communications seemed strangely calculated, as if Wolfe had been preparing for Fritz's departure long before the tragic event occurred. His tone was cold and pragmatic, showing little concern for the personal implications of his actions. This added weight to the theory that Wolfe had been planning to distance himself from Fritz for some time, using his partner's declining health as a stepping stone to fulfill his own ambitions. But the most shocking revelation came when the FBI discovered a voicemail that Fritz had left for a close family member just days before being hospitalized. In the message, Fritz expressed deep concern about Wolfe's behavior. He mentioned feeling pressured by Wolfe to leave the show and implied that Wolfe might be trying to take over completely. Fritz even went so far as to say, "I don't know what's going on, but it seems like something's wrong. Mike is pushing me out. I think he wants me gone, and I'm scared." This voicemail, although cryptic, was crucial in showing that Fritz had felt threatened by Wolfe in the days leading up to his death. It was a damning piece of evidence that Wolfe would struggle to explain. It showed that Fritz was aware of Wolfe's intentions and painted a picture of a man becoming increasingly paranoid about his partner's actions. Fritz's fear and doubt are now laid bare for all to see, and investigators could not ignore the chilling implications of his words. Fritz's voicemail provided a stark insight into the tense relationship between the two men, unveiling a dark side to the story that Wolfe could not deny. As the FBI pieced together the timeline of events and analyzed the evidence, it became increasingly clear that Mike Wolfe was involved in the poisoning of Frank Fritz. Fingerprint evidence, incriminating text messages, and voicemails all pointed to the same conclusion. Wolfe had the motive, opportunity, and means to kill his partner. But the case was far from over. Wolfe's defense team was determined to cast doubt on the evidence. They argued that the fingerprints on the medication bottles could have been left there by accident and that the text messages were simply work-related conversations taken out of context. They even went so far as to claim that Fritz's death could have been a tragic accident with no criminal intent involved. However, as the prosecution continued to present their case, the defense found it increasingly difficult to explain the evidence. The toxicology reports, text messages, voicemails from Fritz, and financial records all painted a picture of a man driven by greed and desperation. Wolfe acted not out of love for his partner, but because of a desire to control his career and ultimately his financial future. The case was becoming clearer, and the evidence against Mike Wolfe grew stronger with each passing day. As the trial proceeded, It became a battle between the tight case presented by the prosecution and the defense's attempts to sow doubt. But one thing was certain. Mike Wolfe's involvement in Frank Fritz's death was no longer a question, but a reality that the court was now forced to confront. As the FBI's investigation into Frank Fritz's death began to scrutinize Mike Wolfe, another name began to surface in connection with the case: Rick Harrison, the star of Pawn Stars, who had long been an influential figure in the reality TV world. Suddenly, Harrison was drawn into a web of suspicion and conspiracy that no one could have predicted. To many, Harrison's connection to the American Pickers duo seemed minimal, but as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that his involvement in the case ran much deeper. More important than anyone imagined, at first the connection between Harrison and Frank Fritz's murder seemed tenuous. While Wolfe and Fritz had spent years working together, frequently traveling across the country to hunt for hidden treasures, Harrison was a more distant figure in their world. As a television personality, Harrison had crossed paths with the American Pickers crew many times, but he was not directly involved in their daily activities. However, not long after, investigators discovered that Harrison's role in this case was much deeper than it appeared. The first clue appeared when the FBI uncovered a series of exchanges between Harrison and Mike Wolfe. These were not just casual business or television discussions. Clearly, Harrison and Wolfe had been discussing much more personal issues. Some messages revealed that the two men confided in each other about their struggles, with Harrison offering advice to Wolfe on how to handle the pressure of being the face of a successful TV show. The story behind these conversations could change everything. Are you ready to uncover it? Hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe now so you won't miss these shocking revelations. As the investigation continued, the nature of these communications began to take on a more disturbing tone. One message, sent just days before Frank Fritz's death, seemed particularly cold. In it, Harrison wrote, "You can do it, Mike, but make sure everything goes the way you want it. You've worked too hard to let anyone get in your way." On the surface, this seemed like a friendly, motivational message, but when considered in the context of Fritz's sudden health decline and the subsequent murder, it took on a completely different meaning. The investigation took on a darker implication. Was Harrison subtly encouraging Wolfe to take control at any cost? The FBI quickly realized that these messages were not just harmless words of support, but potential evidence of an underground alliance between Harrison and Wolfe. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Harrison and Wolfe had more in common than anyone had realized. Both were driven by the desire for control and success, and both had much to lose if American Pickers faltered. The question now is, how far was Rick Harrison willing to go to ensure that he and Wolfe would stay on top? And what role did he play, if any, in the events leading up to the tragic death of Frank Fritz? As investigators dug deeper into Harrison's involvement with Wolfe, they began uncovering more troubling details. One of the most important revelations came when they reviewed Harrison's financial situation. Although he was famous and wealthy, Harrison had been facing significant financial pressure in the years leading up to Fritz's death. Pawn Stars was a hit show, but the financial burden of maintaining such a large production like Pawn Stars was enormous. Harrison had been struggling to keep up with the costs, and it was clear that his relationship with Wolfe and the American Pickers brand was more than just friendship. Harrison seemed to have strategically positioned himself to be part of the future of American pickers. While Fritz was dealing with his health issues, Harrison had been communicating with Wolfe about how both could benefit from Fritz's eventual departure. The reality was that some of the most telling exchanges between Harrison and Wolfe focused on ways to increase their control over the show and its assets. These weren't just business conversations, but plans for the future. And it seemed that Harrison was ready to exploit the situation no matter what happened to Fritz. The most alarming thing for investigators was realizing that Harrison was aware of Wolfe's growing frustration with Fritz long before Frank's death. As the FBI looked deeper into the timeline of events, it seemed that Harrison and Wolfe had been quietly working together to ensure that American pickers would continue to grow, regardless of who was in charge. And if that meant removing Frank Fritz, it all started to fall into place. Wolfe, driven by ambition and greed, had benefited the most from Fritz's death. But what about Harrison? Could he have played a more active role in pushing Fritz out of the picture? Did Harrison know about Wolfe's increasing impatience with Fritz and encouraged him to act decisively? Or was Harrison merely a passive participant, a man unknowingly dragged into a plot by his business partner? The FBI began to believe that Harrison's involvement went beyond that of an innocent outsider. The text messages, financial pressures, the conversations about the future of American pickers, all of these pointed to Harrison being complicit in Wolfe's plan to eliminate Fritz. As the investigation deepened, investigators began to wonder if Harrison was also a part of the plot to poison Fritz, just like Wolfe. But the question remained, why would Rick Harrison, a man with so much to lose, get involved in such a heinous crime? In the end, Harrison had built his career and reputation on being the star of Pawn Stars. Why risk everything for a show that had already been successful? The answer seems to lie in the fragile nature of their empire. In the world of reality television control, all that Wolfe and Harrison had worked tirelessly to create was at stake. As Fritz's health deteriorated, their future began to look uncertain. If Fritz could no longer carry the weight of American pickers, who would? And could Wolfe and Harrison continue to dominate the market without him? As the investigation continued, Harrison's role in this scheme became clearer. While Wolfe appeared to be the mastermind behind the murder, it was Harrison who allowed it to happen, either through direct encouragement or subtle manipulation. Harrison was complicit in a plan that would lead to Frank Fritz's death, and the future of American pickers lay in the hands of Wolfe and Harrison. In the coming days, the FBI would piece together more incriminating evidence, showing that Harrison's involvement was much deeper than anyone initially realized. The case was far from over, and the truth about Frank Fritz's death was slowly being revealed layer by layer. As investigators were closing in on their suspect, one thing became clear. The world of reality television was about to be rocked by an unimaginable scandal. The investigation into Frank Fritz's death had captured the nation's attention, but it was in the courtroom where the real drama would unfold. As the trial began, all eyes were on Mike Wolfe, the once beloved co-star of American Pickers. Now, he was facing murder charges with mounting evidence against him. However, in the courtroom, Wolfe remained defiant, and his testimony would become the focal point of the trial, as he would have to defend himself against a mountain of evidence linking him to Fritz's death. Wolfe's legal team had prepared for a fierce battle. They knew the prosecution's case was strong, but they were determined to present their client in the best light possible. Wolfe's defense strategy was based on a central argument. The evidence linking him to the crime was circumstantial, and there was no direct proof that he killed Frank Fritz. They argued that Wolfe was a grieving friend deeply affected by Fritz's passing, and that the accusations against him stemmed from a misunderstanding and conjecture. Wolfe took the stand early in the trial, and his testimony began with an emotional recounting of his relationship with Frank. He spoke of the years they spent together on American pickers, the countless hours spent traveling the country, and the unique bond they had shared. In a moment of true emotion, his voice choked as he described the pain of losing his co-star and friend. The courtroom fell silent as Wolfe recounted his final conversation with Fritz, painting a picture of a man who had faced many health struggles but still held hope for the future. But as the testimony continued, it became clear that Wolfe's emotional display was not enough to stop the prosecution from questioning him. The defense had tried to humanize Wolfe, but the prosecution was determined to expose the darker side of his actions. The first round of questioning focused on Wolfe's behavior in the days following Fritz's hospitalization. The prosecution zeroed in on Wolfe's apparent lack of grief, as well as his quick actions to secure control of American Pickers' future. The prosecutor began by asking Wolfe about the text messages discovered during the investigation, messages that seemed to show Wolfe cared more about the business aspect of the show than his partner's health. One of the key messages was one Wolfe sent to a producer just hours before Fritz was hospitalized, stating, "We need to be ready for what comes next. Frank's health is a burden, and we need to think about the future without him." The prosecutor asked Wolfe to explain the context of the message, but Wolfe hesitated. "I was just trying to prepare for what might happen," Wolfe said, his voice trembling. "I never meant anything by it. I didn't know he was going to die." However, the prosecutor continued to emphasize that the message seemed more related to work than to caring for Fritz. Wolfe clearly felt uncomfortable, but he stuck to his story, insisting that he was concerned about the future of the show, but never had any intention of causing harm. As the cross-examination continued, the prosecution turned to the toxicology report, which was crucial evidence in the case. They questioned Wolfe about the drugs found in Fritz's body and the fact that his fingerprints were found on some of the bottles containing those drugs. Wolfe was asked why his fingerprints were on the medication bottles, and his answer seemed evasive at best. "I don't know," Wolfe said. "I must have been in the house at some point, but I never touched anything that could harm Frank." The prosecutor, dissatisfied with the response, moved on to the voicemail that Frank had left for a close family member just days before his hospitalization. In the voicemail, Fritz expressed his growing concerns about Wolfe's behavior, saying that he felt pressured to leave the show and even implied that he feared for his safety. The prosecutor played the voicemail in court, and the chilling words were, "I don't know what you want from me, Mike, but I can't keep up anymore. If you're trying to push me out, just say it." Wolfe's face went pale as the voicemail played. Wolfe's defense team immediately objected, but the judge overruled, allowing the recording to remain in the proceedings. Wolfe attempted to dismiss the statement, claiming that Fritz was paranoid and that the voicemail was simply an expression of frustration, but the damage was done. The jury had heard Fritz's own words, and it was clear that there had been something wrong in their relationship long before Fritz's death. The defense tried to counter the prosecution's line of questioning by painting Wolfe as a man under great pressure. They argued that Wolfe had been struggling with his own personal and financial issues, and that the sudden responsibility of taking over American Pickers after Fritz's health deteriorated had weighed heavily on him. However, the prosecution continued to highlight Wolfe's inconsistent behavior and the circumstantial evidence pointing to his guilt. One of the most important moments in Wolfe's testimony came when the prosecutor asked him about the days leading up to Fritz's death. The prosecutor wanted to know specifically what Wolfe had done in the hours before Fritz was hospitalized. Wolfe's answer was vague, and the prosecutor pointed out inconsistencies in his timeline. Wolfe had been in and out of Fritz's house, but his account of what had happened during those visits was unclear. "Were you there the night before Frank died?" the prosecutor asked. Wolfe hesitated. "I think so," he said, "but I hadn't seen him for a while. He wasn't feeling well. He was tired." The prosecutor then asked Wolfe if he had ever given Fritz any medication, and this time Wolfe's hesitation was obvious. He denied any involvement in poisoning Fritz, but the uncertainty in his voice was clear. The jury began to wonder whether Wolfe was telling the truth or trying to hide something. When the testimony ended, the prosecution had presented a compelling case against Mike Wolfe. Evidence from the toxicology report, text messages, voicemails, and fingerprints on medication bottles seemed to point to one conclusion: Wolfe played a significant role in Fritz's death. Was Fritz's death due to greed, jealousy, or something else? Wolfe's actions led to the tragic end of a long-time friendship, and now he had to face the consequences. But the trial was not over, and Wolfe's defense team would continue to fight. The developments in the courtroom were only just beginning. As the case continued, new developments would leave the audience on edge. Would the jury convict Wolfe, or would the defense manage to create enough doubt to secure an acquittal? Only time would tell. But one thing was clear. The truth about Frank Fritz's death was slowly being brought to light, and the men at the center of this case would soon have to face the full weight of their actions. As the trial of Mike Wolfe unfolded, the drama in the courtroom intensified. The prosecution had presented a compelling case, but now it was time for key witnesses to take the stand and provide details that could either strengthen the allegations or create doubt in the minds of the jury. These witnesses were the ones who could confirm suspicions about Wolfe's involvement in Frank Fritz's death or possibly turn the case around with an unexpected twist. The first key witness to take the stand was a longtime friend of Frank Fritz, a woman named Susan Thompson. She had known Frank for over 15 years and had witnessed his relationship with Wolfe firsthand. Thompson's testimony was crucial, as she was one of the few people who could speak about the nature of Wolfe and Fritz's relationship in the months leading up to Frank's death. When Thompson was called to the stand, the courtroom went silent. She seemed nervous but determined to tell the truth. She spoke at length about her friendship with Fritz and how they often discussed his health struggles. According to Thompson, Fritz had grown increasingly concerned about his future with American Pickers due to his declining health. But what struck Thompson as odd was how Wolfe handled these concerns. "I remember Frank telling me that Mike had been pushing him a lot about the show," Thompson recalled. He said Mike was disappointed with how things were going, especially regarding Frank's health. Frank had always been worried that Mike wanted to take over the entire show. The prosecution didn't waste time investigating this revelation. They asked Thompson to elaborate on whether she believed Wolfe had pressured Fritz to step down. Thompson hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "It's entirely possible," she said. Frank felt like Mike was trying to control everything. Frank didn't want to leave, but he also didn't want to be a burden. He was really struggling with that. Thompson's testimony painted a picture of a tense relationship between the two men, casting a shadow on Wolfe's claims of being a caring friend. Her words seemed to support the theory that Wolfe had seen Fritz's declining health as an opportunity to take control of American Pickers and perhaps even take steps to remove him completely from the equation. Testify about the toxicology report and the presence of poison in Fritz's system. Dr. Miller was an expert in toxicology and had analyzed the substances found in Fritz's blood after his death. Her testimony was crucial in confirming whether Fritz's death was truly the result of poisoning and not a natural cause. Dr. Miller explained that the level of toxins found in Fritz's system was not only dangerous, but also indicative of intentional poisoning. She detailed how these substances were not commonly found in over-the-counter medications and could only be used deliberately. These chemicals were not something a person would accidentally ingest. Dr. Miller explained that the concentration of these toxins matched a lethal dose. Clearly, Frank Fritz had been intentionally poisoned. Dr. Miller's testimony was damning, providing scientific support for the prosecution's claim that Frank's death was not an accident. But what made her testimony even more significant was the fact that the poison had been introduced into Fritz's system in a way that suggested someone had easy access to his home and personal belongings. This tied directly into earlier evidence found by the FBI, including fingerprints on medication bottles in Fritz's home. As the prosecution continued to present their case, they introduced a new witness, Robert Harris, a former business associate of Mike Wolfe. Harris had worked with Wolfe on several business projects related to American Pickers, including merchandise deals and sponsorships. Harris's testimony would provide valuable insight into Wolfe's financial situation leading up to Fritz's death and would show that Wolfe had both the motive and the means to commit the crime. Harris explained that Wolfe had been under financial pressure in the months leading up to Fritz's death. Although American Pickers had been successful, Wolfe had made a series of risky business investments that hadn't paid off. Harris revealed that Wolfe had been desperate to secure the future of the show and his financial position, and he had even discussed ways to gain more control over the brand in case something happened to Fritz. He was always talking about what would happen if Frank couldn't continue, Harris testified. He would always say, "We need to make sure the show keeps going, no matter what happens." He even talked about how he would take over if Frank couldn't do it anymore. This testimony was critical because it linked Wolfe's financial struggles with his potential motive for murder. Harris's words painted a picture of a man who could gain everything from Fritz's death and had been preparing for it long before it occurred. The prosecution also called another witness, a former assistant who had worked closely with Wolfe and Fritz during their time on American Pickers. Assistant Emma Johnson spoke about the growing tension between Wolfe and Fritz in the months leading up to the tragedy. Johnson testified that she had witnessed several arguments between the two men, many of which revolved around the future of the show and Fritz's declining health. According to Johnson, Wolfe had expressed his frustration with Fritz's inability to keep up with the demands of the show. "I've heard Mike say more than once that I can't run the show on my own," Johnson recalled. "He seemed frustrated that Frank couldn't keep up, and I remember thinking, If things don't change, they're going to have problems. But I never thought it would go this far. Eventually, the prosecution called the defense's star witness, Mike Wolfe. His testimony had the potential to shift the jury's perspective, as he would have to explain his actions, his relationship with Fritz, and the evidence linking him to the murder. The defense hoped that Wolfe's testimony would humanize him and provide a reasonable explanation for his behavior. However, when Wolfe took the stand, his demeanor changed. He seemed more defensive, and his previously emotional testimony was replaced by a cold, calculated approach. Wolfe's testimony was riddled with contradictions. He continued to deny any involvement in Fritz's death, insisting that he was a loyal friend and that his actions had always been in Fritz's best interests. But as the prosecution presented evidence, Wolfe's story began to unravel. He could not explain the toxicology report, the fingerprints on the medication bottles, or the incriminating text messages he had sent in the days before Fritz was hospitalized. When directly asked whether he had ever poisoned Frank, Wolfe denied it, but his answer lacked the convincing tone needed to persuade the jury. The prosecution succeeded in portraying Wolfe as a man driven by greed and jealousy, willing to do anything to secure his future at American Pickers. As the testimony ended and the case against him grew stronger, it seemed like the tide was turning in favor of the prosecution. The jury had a clear picture of Mike Wolfe, who had the motive, opportunity, and most importantly, the means to kill Frank Fritz. As the trial moved into its final stages, the question remained, will the jury convict Wolfe, or will the defense manage to cast enough doubt to secure an acquittal? With the weight of the testimony behind them, it seemed like the scales of justice were tipping in favor of the prosecution. But in a complex and emotionally charged case like this, anything could happen. As the trial of Mike Wolfe unfolded, the role of digital evidence became increasingly crucial in the case against him. While many aspects of the investigation were based on physical evidence and witness testimony, digital evidence had become an essential factor in uncovering the truth. Text messages, emails, and social media conversations hidden within the digital evidence hold the key to uncovering the deeper motives behind Frank Fritz's death. These messages provide a window into Wolfe's mind, revealing thoughts and conversations that were never meant to be made public. They hint at a chilling level of premeditation. The most important of these digital communications came from Wolfe's personal phone, which investigators seized immediately after his arrest. It contained a wealth of messages between him and various business partners, associates, and most importantly, Frank Fritz. The nature of these exchanges tells the story of a man not only dealing with the pressures of running a television show, but also clearly struggling with feelings of control, frustration, and a desire to ensure his financial future, no matter the cost. One of the first messages that caught the investigators' attention was one that Wolfe sent to a production assistant just days before Frank was hospitalized. In the message, Wolfe wrote, "We need to be ready for the worst-case scenario. If Frank can't pull it together, we'll have to adjust. I can't do this without him, but we need to think ahead." At first glance, this seemed like a simple business message, but for investigators, it suggested something far darker. The choice of words "think ahead" and "adjust" seemed oddly calculated, as though Wolfe had planned for a future without his partner, no matter what impact that would have on them. The prosecution later argued that this message, among others, pointed to Wolfe being fully aware that Fritz's health was deteriorating and that he was preparing for a future without him. This wasn't just about being a responsible business partner, it was about securing his future and his control over the future of American pickers. Wolfe seemed willing to take drastic measures to ensure the show would continue without bearing the burden of Fritz's health issues. But it wasn't just Wolfe's business dealings that raised concerns. What was revealed in these texts was far more personal. Embedded in these messages would become the focal point of the prosecution's case. One message sent by Wolfe to a close friend seemed to show his growing frustration with Fritz's declining health. The message read, "Frank is slowing us down, he can't keep up anymore. We may need to start thinking about the show without him." This message was sent just weeks before Fritz's death, and it was chilling. It wasn't just about work anymore, but a clear expression of Wolfe's impatience and dissatisfaction with his co-star's inability to meet the demands of the show. The timing of this message is significant. It was sent right after Fritz had taken a break from filming due to health issues, and it seemed as though Wolfe was preparing for a scenario in which his co-star could no longer contribute to the show. For the investigators, it signaled a shift in Wolfe's thinking. He was no longer just concerned about the future of American pickers, he was actively planning for a world in which he held the reins. As the prosecution continued to piece these messages together, they uncovered further evidence of Wolfe's growing desperation in the days leading up to Fritz's hospitalization. Wolfe had sent a message to a business associate discussing the logistics of American pickers without Fritz. In the message, Wolfe stated, "I need to take control of this. We've carried Frank long enough. It's time to make some hard decisions." This message marked another turning point in the investigation. Not only did it prove Wolfe's desire to take over the show, but it also suggested the level of resentment toward his co-star. The choice of words, "We've carried Frank long enough," and the harsh criticism were telling. Wolfe's tone had shifted from concern or collaboration to frustration and selfishness. Perhaps the most shocking message was sent just hours before Fritz was hospitalized. In it, Wolfe wrote to a fellow producer, "It's time we move forward, and Frank is in the way. If something happens to him, we're ready to take over." This message sent chills down investigators' spines, as it seemed to confirm their suspicions that Wolfe had somehow predicted Fritz's death. It seemed to suggest that Wolfe had already decided the future of American pickers, with or without Fritz. The use of the phrase, "if something happens to him," was eerily ambiguous. Was it just a simple accident, or did Wolfe know something was about to happen? The prosecution quickly brought this message to the jury's attention, arguing that it was further evidence of Wolfe's deliberate actions. The intent of the message wasn't just a casual remark, but a clear indication that Wolfe was actively planning for a future without his partner, and he was preparing for what would come next. However, the defense was ready to counter the prosecution's claims. They argued that while the texts were relevant, they were simply the result of Wolfe's stress and frustration with the pressure of running a successful show. They claimed that Wolfe's words had been taken out of context and that there was no evidence proving he actually poisoned Fritz. Instead, they argued that the messages were part of a larger pattern of Wolfe's communication style, often straightforward and direct. The defense portrayed Wolfe as a man under immense pressure, facing the decline of his beloved show and the challenges of working with a partner whose health was rapidly deteriorating. While the defense presented their argument, the jury was left with a clear impression that Wolfe's texts showed a behavioral pattern that seemed to support the prosecution's case. These messages were not just the product of a stressed businessman. They revealed a man who had planned for a world without Frank Fritz, a world in which he held control, and in that world, there was no room for his co-star. As the prosecution continued presenting their case, they introduced more digital evidence. In addition to the text messages, they discovered a series of emails between Wolfe and various business associates discussing the future of American Pickers in the event that Fritz suddenly left. These emails, though less direct than the text messages, proved Wolfe's concern about maintaining control over the show. One email exchange between Wolfe and a producer read, "If Frank can't participate, we need a backup plan. The show can't continue without me." This email also raised alarms, showing that Wolfe saw himself as the only one capable of moving the show forward, and it cast a shadow over his relationship with Fritz. Digital evidence against Mike Wolfe was mounting, with each text, email, and voicemail being another piece of the puzzle. And as they all fell into place, the prosecution's case grew stronger. Wolfe's own words showed his true intent. He had prepared to take over no matter the consequences. And as the evidence continued to pile up, the question remained. Did Wolfe really go as far as poisoning Frank Fritz to secure his position at American Pickers? The digital messages told the story of a man who had no intention of letting anyone get in his way. Frank Fritz's death had shaken the world of American Pickers, but it wasn't just the tragic loss of a beloved co-star. Behind the scenes, a much darker story was unfolding, a story of financial desperation, jealousy, and the complex web of relationships in the reality TV world. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that money, not just personal rivalry, had played a significant role in the events leading up to Fritz's death. For many years, American Pickers had been a cash cow for its stars, generating millions of dollars in profits not just from the TV show, but also from merchandise deals, brand partnerships, and a loyal fan base. Mike Wolfe, the face of the show, had built an empire around the antique hunting brand. He had made a name for himself as a savvy entrepreneur who could turn junk into treasures, and his partnership with Frank Fritz helped solidify American Pickers as a household name. However, as the show became more successful, the accompanying financial pressures also grew. Wolfe's role in the business had multiplied exponentially over the years, and he had been involved in several sponsorship deals and public appearances. While Fritz initially shared the spotlight with Wolfe, it soon became clear that the power dynamic on the show was shifting. Fritz, despite his deep knowledge and love for antiques, was struggling with his health and found himself sidelined as the demands of the show became more demanding. On the other hand, Wolfe was thriving in the spotlight, expanding his personal brand and taking on new projects outside of the show. The shifting dynamics between the two men began to cause tension. Although both men had started the show as equals, Wolfe's increasing control over the brand led to resentment. Fritz grew frustrated with his diminishing role in the show, especially as his health issues worsened. For Fritz, the idea of being sidelined was not just a personal issue but a financial one. He had been part of the show's success from the beginning, and now, with his ability to participate in the show increasingly limited, he feared for his financial future. He had spent years building the brand with Wolfe, and yet it seemed that Wolfe was preparing to move on without him. This realization was both painful and unsettling for Fritz. As the financial pressures mounted, Wolfe's behavior began to change. Investigators found that in the months leading up to Fritz's death, Wolfe had been working to expand the American Pickers brand further without Fritz. Wolfe had negotiated with several companies about merchandise deals for spin-off shows and new business ventures that could help secure his future. But Fritz's health was deteriorating, and he didn't want to step down. This created a significant barrier for Wolfe, and the situation grew increasingly uncomfortable. He knew that if Fritz could no longer contribute to the show, he could ultimately take full control, and as Wolfe's financial stakes increased, so did his desperation. However, Fritz was not entirely passive in this situation. He actively fought to maintain his relevance in the world of American pickers. Despite his health problems, Fritz hoped he could continue contributing to the show, even if that meant scaling back his participation. He had also started exploring his own business ventures in the hope of creating a separate source of income that would allow him to regain some independence. However, this decision did not sit well with Wolfe. The idea of Fritz expanding and possibly finding success outside American pickers threatened to destabilize the power dynamic that Wolfe had worked so hard to build. The increasing tension between the two men showed through several heated arguments in the weeks leading up to Fritz's death. Friends and colleagues noticed a distinct change in how the two men interacted with each other. Their once friendly relationship had turned into something more akin to rivalry. Wolfe had both financial and personal motives to act, but there was another layer to this story, one that wasn't just about money but also about deep jealousy and the fear of losing control. Fritz's growing dissatisfaction with his role in the show fueled his own jealousy toward Wolfe. He had always prided himself on his expertise and contributions to the show's success, but as Wolfe continued to take more control and expand the brand, Fritz began to feel like a supporting actor in the final months of his life. Fritz had expressed to friends that he feared he was being pushed out both personally and professionally. He had worked with Wolfe for many years, and now, as his health declined, it seemed as though he had become expendable. The jealousy and resentment had formed between the two men, not just over work or money, but also over pride, recognition, and the desire to maintain control. Wolfe had always been the more dominant personality, but Fritz had built his own reputation, and he wasn't ready to give it up just yet. The financial stakes were high, but the personal stakes were even higher. Wolfe knew that if he could eliminate Fritz, he could secure his position as the undisputed leader of American pickers, and in doing so, protect his future and financial independence. For Fritz, however, the threat of being removed from the picture wasn't just a financial blow, it was a blow to his pride and self-esteem. He had built his career alongside Wolfe, and now, with his health declining, it seemed that Wolfe was ready to move on without him. The mix of pride, jealousy, and financial desperation ultimately led to Fritz's tragic death. Wolfe's desire to control American pickers, combined with Fritz's growing resentment and the financial pressures both men faced, created the perfect storm. And when Fritz's health deteriorated to the point where he could no longer participate in the show, the opportunity for Wolfe to act was too great to pass up. The financial motive was clear, but the emotional cost of that decision was just as significant. Wolfe not only lost a business partner, but also lost a friend, a colleague who had always been by his side in every circumstance. But in the world of reality television, friendship is often secondary to success. Wolfe's decision to act on his own desires, driven by the twin forces of money and jealousy, would lead to consequences far beyond anything he could have predicted. As the trial continues, the question remains, did Mike Wolfe's ambition really drive him to kill his best friend? The financial implications are undeniable, and the personal motive is just as clear. But ultimately, the jury will decide whether Wolfe's jealousy and greed pushed him to make the final move, and whether he was willing to sacrifice everything, including his conscience, for the future of American pickers. Can jealousy and ambition push someone to that point? Leave comment number 1 if you sympathize with Mike Wolfe, or number 0 if you have a different opinion. Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next exciting videos. See you in the next one.